The Atlanta Braves kicked off the offseason by making a trade of Jorge Soler. Let's talk about it. Yes, welcome on in to Braves Today, your source of news, notes, and updates on your Atlanta Braves. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby. Follow me on Twitter at Crosby Baseball. He's Christian Rauh. Follow him on Twitter at Christian S. Rauh, R-A-U-H. You can follow the show on Twitter, Braves_today. We have a Facebook page and Instagram as well. And as always, all of our written work, BravesToday.com. It's both a newsletter and a podcast. And Christian, we dropped 2 stories on the Substack yesterday. One of them was an accident. I didn't realize my Tim Hires article was not set to go out the day that we talked to him on the press conference, so that got published. But I had to publish another piece yesterday because the Atlanta Braves started the offseason on day one, literally day one of the offseason, by making a trade, sending outfielder Jorge Soler, I'm using outfielder in air quotes, outfielder Jorge Soler to the Los Angeles Angels in return for right-hand pitcher Griffin Canning. And Atlanta sent no money in the deal. Soler will cost $13 million for the Angels in both 25 and 26. The cap hit was different for Atlanta based on, he was going to count $16 million for Atlanta on the cap hit for some other charges and things like that. You recalculate those when you make the trade. But I want to get to Soler first before we talk about Griffin Canning and what his future is with Atlanta. We did a show a few weeks ago saying you had to trade one of these guys. And this feels like this was the right move and the right one of the two to move, wasn't it?
Yeah, it seemed like it was inevitable that Soler was going to be moved. It seemed like the right piece. First of all, I'm glad that Alex was the guy to make the first move of the free agency. I didn't know it was going to be 20 minutes after we were allowed to do something. Give us a chance to breathe at least. But regardless, I'm actually really excited that it's getting started and we got a lot to talk about. We had to shift some shows around, but that's okay. A lot of things to flex about this.
Speaking of, folks, the mailbag's going to be on Monday. Okay, I'm pushing the mailbag back to Monday because we want to talk about this today.
And as we should, because it's obviously a big deal, the trade. We got a lot to talk about. We already have a new looking Braves roster for 2025, and we weren't even 24 hours away from the World Series being ended. So pretty cool. But overall, the biggest part of this might not be the pitcher you get back. The overall thing is there's some cap space. Not cap space. There's no cap in baseball. There's some salary space with the Braves, with heading into free agency. A lot of things to talk about. And I think adding that little extra cash, that little flow is going to go a long way with some of these players and some of these positions that we're looking to hopefully improve this offseason.
Yeah, it works both ways. You get rid of the salary of Jorge Soler. Now you have a bigger question about your left field, right? This is something where Jared Kelenic, as of now, is your starter in left field. Ramon Laureano, I feel like, is probably a better bet to come back on his final year of arbitration than he initially was. He's projected per MLB trade rumors to make $6.1 million in arbitration this year. You do also add an arbitration salary for Griffin Canning. He is projected at 5.1 if he's tendered. We'll get to him in a few minutes. But what this does is gives you the ability to have better outfield defense and not have a logjam if Ronald Acuna Jr. does need designated hitter time here and there in 2025, like he did in 2022 when he came back from the knee injury. It's a little bit easier to give him that without completely screwing up the outfield defense by having to play Jorge Soler in the field or something like that. It is, I think the bigger takeaway of this here, and this is going to be an angle not a lot of people have talked about yet. I think the bigger angle of trading Jorge Soler is that now you have future flexibility with the DH position, right? This is the final year of Marcell Ozuna. He's going to be making $16 million on that club option, which is not technically picked up yet, but is going to get picked up. Like, as of time of recording, they have not announced it yet, but they're going to do this. But that's his final year. So you can choose to re-sign him for his age 35 season if you want to next offseason, or you now have the ability to say, let Sean Murphy get almost every day at bats by having him behind the plate some and having him at DH some. You have the ability to, maybe you call up Drake Baldwin, and that's something where you can use that DH spot as let the other catcher hit. Baldwin's a lefty hitting catcher. Murphy's a guy that we talked about this on the show. We wrote about this on the Substack, does a lot better with more frequent playing time. You have some flexibility there. Whereas if you kept Jorge Soler, he projected out to be in the field this year while Ozuna was DH, and then he was locked in as your designated hitter once Ozuna left. And that puts you in a situation of having less flexibility than ideal. So this is a good deal, I think, overall, to get rid of that money and to give yourself that future flexibility. I have questions about Griffin Canning, though. Are we going to see him play in Atlanta? Because the surface stats aren't really good.
Yeah, before we get to Canning, closing the book on Soler, maybe he might be back. You never know, but it's true. This is what
pull a Jesse Chavez. Just come back. Yeah.
There's always a chance. There's always a chance when it comes to the Atlanta Braves. But closing the book on him, you traded for him on the trade deadline last season, and then you get a half a year from him. They get to the playoffs. Would you call that trade successful, even though you just traded him minutes once after the offseason began, Lindsay?
So I don't really think you gave up a ton for Jorge Soler, right? You moved Tyler Matzik in the deal. He's now back, right? He was DFA'd by the Giants, so they ate the rest of that money, and then you re-signed him to a minor league deal. Sabin Ceballos was a college third baseman that they wanted to try out some at shortstop. They obviously didn't feel like that was going to work out because they did not let him play any shortstop with Atlanta last year, despite them telling him and telling some of us that he was going to do it. He batted .259 with 3 home runs in 84 games in high A as a 21-year-old out of college. And at the end of the day, I don't think that was a very big loss as far as at the prospect capital you had to move here, right? He didn't have the power profile to project to be an everyday regular at third. You have Austin Riley signed for 1 million years. So the fact you used Soler and made the playoffs, I think makes it valuable, if nothing else, for the little bit of extra revenue that you got for being in the postseason. But I don't necessarily think that it's not a loss of a trade, but you didn't really win the trade. It is what it is. And in the end, pretty inconsequential. But technically, you did get a little bit better through making that trade.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that one. It's just always fun to look back and see if that's worth it. But yeah, I think you give a good grade on that trade because, you didn't really give up much. And it got you to the postseason, right? You filled the void that was needed. So looking at Griffin Canning, how do you fix him? What do you need to do to fix this guy? Because 6-13 record, 5.19 ERA, that's not good numbers. What I do like about his numbers, Lindsay, is that he pitched 171 innings last year. And that is gigantic for the Braves because that would have been third on the team, other than Sale and other than Fried. You have the potential of losing Max Fried. And then in fourth place, by the way, was Charlie Morton, which I know we're going to talk about later on in the show. But Griffin Canning, 171 innings. If you can find a way to get that ERA down a little bit, maybe with some better defensive behind him. I know his FIP wasn't any better last year, but you got to think that there's some sort of improvements you can get from a guy that's only 28 years old, has some pretty decent breaking ball stuff. Could be pretty fun to see if he can get fixed.
Yeah. So funny you should ask. I actually wrote that piece last night for the Substack. And again, BravesToday.com, if you want to go read it, it's the first article on the site. The big takeaway for me is this kind of fits in with what the Braves like to do with pitchers that they acquire. And I'm thinking about Charlie Morton and Pierce Johnson, right? Both of those guys are guys that their best pitch is a secondary pitch. It's not their fastball. For both of their guys, it's their curveball. Canning's best pitch, I'd argue by far, is his changeup. And it was the only pitch of his that graded out positively last year. When you go back and you look at the seasons where he's been better or the stretches where he's been better, right? He had a good month of May. He went 1-1, which pitcher wins are done, 2.60 ERA. And the way that he was effective there was he threw his fastball less. He threw his slider and curveball and changeup more. And for Atlanta, they are big on, If you have a pitch that is really good, we're going to have you throw it more. Pierce Johnson throws like 80% curveballs now. Charlie Morton was a elevated fastball guy with the Rays, and the Braves got him, and they said, we want you to throw more curveballs and fastballs. And Griffin Canning feels like a guy, if you can minimize the usage of the fastball, he's right under 40% fastball usage. If you can bring it down to 30% or so, and then you can ramp up use of the changeup. And then for me, the other thing that I'm asking for is improve the slider. His slider doesn't really move a lot. It has a little bit of drop to it, but it doesn't really move. And it, in essence, functions like a slow fastball. The issue with this is it also got hit like one. He gave up a 284 batting average on that slider. And so what does Atlanta do? They're really good at encouraging you to use your secondary pitches more. They're really good at improving a guy's slider, right? It's one of the things. They gave Grant Holmes a slider. They've got a lot of guys who can get really good sliders in this system. I feel like the blueprint, if you want to keep Griffin Canning, because he's projected to be a $5 million guy in arbitration, if you want to keep Griffin Canning, I feel like the trick to doing that is to minimize the fastball usage by ramping up the changeup and the slider and making the slider better. The fixing the fastball in and of itself is a bigger issue because it is very much a dead zone fastball, but there is a path to making him better than what he's currently shown, where he could be a number 5 and it's not the end of the world.
A number 5 pitcher at $5 million is not, when you're looking at in hindsight what you've seen in the past from guys. I mean, how much was Charlie Morton last year, right?
20 million.
You know, a lot more than 5, right? So
yeah.
Canning could be a good piece. I do think one of the biggest issues that we saw from the Braves last year was trying to find innings from different pitching after the injuries to Strider and things like that. Some of the young pitchers that came up weren't as successful as you wanted to. You had to use a couple non-starters at sometimes as well. But the interesting part about Canning, and you mentioned it a little bit, was the dead fastball. But I want to know a little bit about that, though. So can you get a little more in depth about what really that dead fastball means?
Let me put my pitching nerd hat on. Okay. All right.
Yeah, please.
All right. Think about when you watch Chris Sale. Okay. Chris Sale releases very sidearm, and the pitch kind of flies across the plate. It moves a lot horizontally. And the issue with Griffin Canning is he is like an exact 45-degree angle, and his fastball moves exactly like you expect it to. What a dead zone fastball is, to be simple with this, is the fastball moves exactly like a hitter would expect based on the arm angle that it is released. He gets below average vertical break on it, but he gets below average horizontal movement on it. And so because of that, it comes in the path of the ball is exactly what you think it would be. And Atlanta has been pretty good at tweaking a guy's fastball release, his arm angle, moving things just to make it do something different. Because the whole thing behind pitching, and there's some great graphs I have in the Braves Today piece if you want to go read that for everybody listening. But the big thing about pitching is you want the hitter to be uncomfortable, right? With how your pitch moves, how hard you're throwing it, the sequencing you throw them in, things like that. In Griffin Canning's case, the fastball is not deceptive at all. He lost over a mile an hour of velocity from 23 to 24. It moves exactly like you think it would because it has below average horizontal, below average vert. Tweaking that, if you can fix that, great. I don't know if you can fix it, or if you feel comfortable you can fix it in enough time to be effective next year. But I feel like at the very least, they can help him find that velo, and they can help him ramp up the other pitches, tweak the slider to move more. He did pull out a sweeper at the end of last season that looked really good. It was over a foot break, 85 miles an hour. It was one of the better sweepers that I saw last year. There is a blueprint here for an effective pitcher. And so I don't necessarily think they're going to just non-tender him the end of the month. I legitimately think they might tender him a contract. Maybe they just sign him to a deal and avoid arbitration completely and try to fix him because he gives you another option for your rotation.
That's interesting. See, I knew a little bit about that. I didn't know that in as as much as you explained it, so I appreciate the nerdiness behind it. But
Yes.
Canning is an interesting piece. I think he could be a really potentially a nice piece for the back of the rotation for the Braves. When you think about how the season just went, Lindsay, I think
Mhm.
we've discussed this a few times. We wanted to have what, 10 guys? You want to have about 9 or 10 guys heading into this season based on what we Atlanta had to use last season, over the season, over with the injuries and things like that. Adding a guy like Cannon that threw 170 something innings last year, 127 innings the year before that. So if you're getting 130, 140 innings from a guy that can sit in the back of your rotation, hopefully give you something like Charlie Morton did, get down his ERA to around a sub 4, not a 5.2 like he had this season. If you can get
Mhm.
a 3.9 ERA or even like a 4.1, 4.2 ERA from a guy like Canning after 140 innings, I think you call that success. And for $5 million, I think you call that an ultimate success.
Yeah. And speaking of Morton, we got some interesting news about him and his future. We'll break that down next, right here on Braves Today. Welcome back to Braves Today. Lindsay, Crosby, Christian Rauh talking about the Jorge Soler trade from yesterday, acquiring Griffin Canning, and my belief that the Braves can fix him, right? Saw a lot of fantasy baseball people saying, hey, go pick up Griffin Canning. He's having a rebound year next year because he's in the Atlanta system. But we got some other news yesterday. Mark Bowman of MLB.com dropped his what to know about the Braves offseason, his primer piece. And he buried a little note in there talking about all the free agents. And I'm going to read you the quote here because it was some news that we didn't have until yesterday. Quote, there was also an assumption that Morton would retire, but the hurler, who will turn 41 on November 12th, is leaning towards pitching at least one more season. Atlanta needs some insurance for Spencer Strider, who is returning from right elbow ligament surgery and in the back end of its rotation. Morton could be an option with a 1-year deal worth $10 to $15 million. If Charlie Morton were to return next year on a reduced deal, so not necessarily, not making $20 million, making 10 or 15, let's say Atlanta brings him back when free agency starts, the day free agency starts. That would mean going into free agency, here are the list of starting pitchers in alphabetical order that you expect to have at some point in time in 2024 or 2025. Ian Anderson, Bryce Elder, Grant Holmes, Ronaldo Lopez, Charlie Morton, Chris Sale, Spencer Schwellenbach, AJ Smith-Shriver, AJ Smith-Shawver, Spencer Strider, and then I'm going to add Griffin Canning to that if you keep him. That's 10. The reason I think 10 is important is every season since 2020, 21, 22, 23, 24, you've used between 10 and 13 starting pitchers, not counting relievers working as openers. You've used between 10 and 13 starting pitchers. Going into free agency with 10 already means that now you have the flexibility to, you don't have to find a guy just to find a guy. You pointed out great innings history from Canning last year. He pitched plenty of innings. And with so many guys in this rotation being question marks for health, for workload, for performance, whatever it might be, having 10 guys feels like that's probably the deepest your rotation has been under Alex Anthopoulos to start an offseason.
Yeah, and I don't have my abacus right in front of me, Lindsay, but when I look at that potential deal of what Charlie Morton could be going from 20 million to potentially 10 to 15 on a 1-year deal, you could, theoretically, you could have Charlie Morton and Griffin Canning, both who are absolute inning eaters if you look at their last couple seasons, at the back of your rotation and be spending less than what you paid for just Charlie Morton last year. There is a
Yeah.
potential chance for that. Really, the only question then comes into play is, are you willing to spend an extra roster spot on having that for that pitching depth, which I do think is a good idea. But when you look at those 10 pieces, those are a lot of really nice things moving forward. Obviously, you brought up Bryce Elder, so the fact that he's not even in the conversation might not hurt for the nice conversation for when it comes to our YouTube comments, but that's okay.
Be nice, folks. Okay. Be nice on YouTube, please.
But when you talk about those 10 pitchers, that's exactly what you need because, as you mentioned, the last couple seasons, 10 to 13 different pitchers, you do have injuries. And it also did seem you did not point out some names, some younger names that you saw last year And that shows that you don't have to go reach for the well, reach into double A and bring up a guy into the major leagues if you have some of these veteran presence. Although it did work very well for Spencer Schwellenbach, it gives those young players a chance to develop more in the minor leagues, maybe a full season in Gwinnett for a guy like Hurston Waldrop, because you don't have to use them right away because you have veteran presence up at the major league level, assuming everything is healthy. So now, I'm a really big fan of seeing what Canning can do. Obviously, you still have a couple weeks to figure
Mhm.
out if you're going to decide to keep him. I think free agency is going to pull a really big deal with that. I think we're going to get a couple of those really big pitching names off the books right away because the Braves aren't the only team that have decisions like this to make. So once we do see some of those big names come off the board, I think we'll get a better understanding of what they're going to do with guys like Canning. If they do bring back Morton, I could see Morton being a day one free agency signing though on Monday or
Yeah.
Tuesday. I could see that
And
happening because if he does come back, he's going to be a Brave. Like he's not going
and
anywhere else.
yeah, and technically, Atlanta can sign him before then. You're in the exclusive negotiating window with your own free agents right now. You can re-sign your own guys. You don't have to wait until they want a free agency. And I believe Joe Jimenez and Pierce Johnson, I think they signed in that 5-day window last offseason. So you could see some deals. A deal could drop while we're recording the show. Like it could happen at any time. And to your point, I didn't even mention Hurston Waldrop. I also didn't mention prospects who haven't debuted yet. I think Lucas Braun could be a guy we see this year. I think Drew Hackenberg could be a guy we see this year. I think Blake Burkhalter could be a guy we could see this year. And I didn't mention guys that I've written about that I would be fine if they took them off the 40-man roster. I didn't mention Alan Winans. I didn't mention Dylan Dodd. They've already gotten rid of Darius Vines off the 40-man roster. He was DFA'd. That's not counting Huascar Yanoa, who could be in the bullpen this year. You've got lots of options here. And I think you have lots of options, but you feel better about some of those back end options than you felt when you were rolling out a brand new Hurston Waldrop, when you were rolling out an 89 mile an hour fastball of Alan Winans, a 91 mile an hour Darius Vines fastball, things like that. So the depth is much better. And I think it gives you the ability to be more selective in free agency. I do want to point out every postseason, you've been looking for a game 3 starter, right? Whether it was Charlie Morton was hurt, you had to start Bryce Elder in a game. You started AJ Smith-Shawver started the game. You've been looking for game 3 starters, or in this case, game 2 starter of the wild card series this year. Figuring out who can be at the top of that is good. But even right now, you would assume Strider would be back to form by the postseason. Theoretically, Sale, Lopez, Schwellenbach, there's 4 right there you feel should be good enough to start a postseason game. And there's growth potential with some of these other guys, right? You could see Smith-Shawver, who you've used in the postseason before. Ian Anderson, you could see him back to form in the postseason. There's Grant Holmes, I think is a dog and could be a postseason starter. There's plenty of options here. So definitely you feel better about this. I don't know if they'd bring back Morton and go get another veteran. I think he would be the veteran. But right now, all you need him for is the 5th starting spot and depth. And I feel this is a great place to be. And honestly, this is the best pre-free agency rotation I think I've seen the Braves have in a long time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And obviously a guy like Canning doesn't fix all the problems and obviously is not going to be an improvement compared to Max Fried if they wind up losing him in free agency.
Mm-hmm.
But it gives you a little bit of more peace of mind, if you will, about showing that the Braves are going to add depth moving forward into 2025. And it also shows that maybe pitching doesn't have to be the priority this winter. Maybe they can focus on other spots, like deciding to answer if left field is truly going to be a a need. And of course, shortstop. There's always a talk about then shortstop be improved. Maybe
Yeah.
those can be a priority instead of adding more to the pitching rotation. I don't think they're done regardless in either of those positions, though.
Yeah, I would honestly argue that rotation is now probably the 3rd priority behind left field and shortstop, unless you can find a slam dunk postseason starter, right? If you are trading for Garrett Crochet, okay, right. Another lefty in the rotation would be great. And that's a move. But if you bring back Morton, I don't think you really should even look at the veteran pitching market via trade unless it's a dude who you say, yes, this guy absolutely would be a postseason starter. And if it's not
Yep.
that situation, I don't think you even worry about it.
I don't disagree. Surefire thing or nothing when it comes to the trades for veteran presence. If you can bring back a guy like Morton, I agree.
Exactly. All right, folks, we're going to be back on Monday. Unless some news happens over the weekend, I'll hop on and do an emergency show if news happens over the weekend. We want to hear from you, though. Let us know what you want. What you want to know about. We're going to do the mailbag episode. It'll be a mailbag Monday. But then also let us know about what is your wish list for left field? What is your wish list for shortstop? How should the Braves fix these? Who should they target via trade or in free agency? Let us know. I'm on Twitter at Crosby Baseball. Christian's on Twitter, Christian S. Rauh, Rauh. Braves_today is the Twitter page for the show. We're on Facebook and Instagram as well. You can even email us, contact@bravestoday.com. And until next time, this has been Braves